from the heart of where innovation, money, and power collide. In Silicon Valley and beyond, this is Bloomberg Technology with Emily Chang.
I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, a landmark ruling by a deeply divided Supreme Court opens the door for more people to carry guns in public. This as the country is grappling with a rise in gun violence, and companies are trying to get workers back to the office. Plus, he was suspended from Google for voicing concerns about an AI bot he says is a person. My sit-down interview with engineer Blake Lemoine. Why does he think computers have feelings, and why does it matter? What does he think big tech should do to deal with it? An in-depth conversation coming up. And continued concerns about the power of big tech. I'm joined by the CEO of Proton, Andy Yen, who's in Washington right now fighting for antitrust reform. All of that in a moment, but first I want to get a look at the markets. Investors looking to tech as fears of a recession grow. Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow here with the latest. Ed, walk us through the day.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's momentum in the technology sector. We're up in 3 of the last 4 sessions on the NASDAQ 100 and up meaningfully. You look at the NASDAQ 100, very tech-heavy index. All of the mega caps on there are up 1.5%. But not all tech created equal. We see weakness in semiconductors, for example. The story of the day on Thursday was this pullback in yield. So much Fed speak. Fed Powell again on Capitol Hill giving his view of the world and the outlook for the Fed, the outlook for inflation and rates, and basically reaffirming his commitment to tackling inflation at any cost, which of course adds to recession fears. So it's interesting. Why is tech up in this environment? I have this chart on the Bloomberg terminal that I've been looking at. I'm trying to look at the tea leaves. There's a lot of mixed messages. It's been a week where we've been up and then we've been down and we're back up again. But we look at this 200-day moving average. In simple terms, very few stocks on the tech sector of the S&P 500 are trading above their 200-day moving average. For most traders, that is a bearish signal. But there are other signals out there. For example, if you look at NASDAQ 100 E-mini futures for September, they have been up 3 of the last 4 sessions. Those are futures for September. Forward-looking, the direction of travel, it looks like we're getting some optimism around the technology sector. There's been this discussion about Bitcoin, which hovers at around $20,000 per token, as being a leading indicator for risk assets. And there are names out there like Scott Minerd of Guggenheim, Mark Mobius, a legendary investor, of course, talking about how we won't see a bottom in equities until we see that bottom in Bitcoin. But I'm looking at this chart as we look for some direction. And as always, there's so many stories for individual companies and individual stocks pulling us in different directions. Just 3 that I'm looking at this Thursday. Netflix, we're going to talk about this later in the show, actually closing up 1.5%. There was volatility on that stock in this session. News of job cuts, Em. You and I will dig into that later on. Tesla, down 0.4%. Lots of news in the last 24 hours. Comments Elon Musk made back in May on the cash burn from factories that have just been built as they ramp up. But now the market's starting to digest those comments. Also a scoop from Bloomberg about how capacity is being added in Shanghai, and Apple, top of the pile, biggest points mover on Thursday.
All right, Ed Ludlow, thank you. We'll get back to you later in the show. I want to get to another story now that could have wide-reaching implications. A divided Supreme Court struck down a New York law that could limit who could carry a handgun in public. That limited who could carry a handgun in public, issuing a landmark ruling that could mean more guns on the streets of big cities that have struggled to contain a rash of gun violence, as companies are also trying to get workers back into the office. For more, I'm joined by Bloomberg's Greg Storr, who covers the Supreme Court for us. So, Greg, just walk us through what this new law really means.
Yeah, so this ruling affects primarily 6 states that have so-called may issue permit laws, meaning they don't have to give everybody who applies a license to carry a handgun in public. All those states require a showing of some sort of special need. The group includes California, New York, Massachusetts, New Jersey, so some really big states with some really big cities. And those laws are probably doomed at this point. Those states are going to have to start letting typical people who say, I want a handgun for self-defense purposes, those people are going to have to get a permit.
This is all happening, obviously, we've been covering the very tragic news across the country where we've seen the impacts of gun violence, but also you have companies trying to get workers back to the office, and some of them say they don't even feel safe riding the subway. How do you expect companies, which are increasingly being put under pressure to respond or take a stand on social issues, to respond to this?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So a couple things to keep in mind. First of all, this probably won't have an immediate effect in that these states are going to have to set up a new permitting system. And so it's not just that people can suddenly take their handgun out in public immediately. They're going to have to get a permit once that new system is set up. And the second thing is, companies are probably going to find that their employees have different reactions. Some of them are going to feel less safe because there are more handguns out there and they're worried about the people with guns. And some people might feel more safe commuting because they will now have the ability to get a permit to carry a gun themselves. So it may depend in part on what companies hear from their employees.
We've also seen a number of tech companies offer to pay for employees to move out of states like Texas, where they've been limiting abortion. Are we still expecting a ruling on Roe versus Wade in the next 24 hours?
Maybe not in the next 24 hours, although we are getting more Supreme Court opinions tomorrow, so it's possible at 10 o'clock Eastern time tomorrow that's what we'll get. But the court still has 8 opinions left. We're going to certainly get some next week, too, starting on Monday. So just mathematically, the odds are probably that we'll get it next week rather than tomorrow.
Okay, well, we'll be following your reporting on all of it. Bloomberg's Greg Storr, thank you for that update. I want to turn now to another story that could have a big impact on society and politics around the world. Bloomberg has learned Meta is reducing its support for a tool it owns to keep misinformation in check. It's called CrowdTangle, and it's been used to spot false information, including in elections. We're less than 6 months now before the U.S. midterms, and there are concerns that without a tool like CrowdTangle, it could lead to voters being manipulated. For more on this, I'm joined by Bloomberg's Sarah Frier. So, Sarah, put this into context for us. How important has CrowdTangle been to fighting misinformation on Facebook's platform to this point?
Well, it's interesting because when Facebook bought CrowdTangle in 2016, they thought of it as this tool that could help media organizations get smarter about what they publish on social media. Because what it does is it shows you which stories are going viral, what's working and what's not working online. Well, after the backlash from what happened in the 2016 presidential elections, that became an indispensable tool for finding what kinds of content that was going viral in general that might be harmful, lies about elections, for instance. And so researchers have really come to depend on this tool, which has just a stream of data, not just from Facebook, but from Twitter and Reddit, Instagram. So if you are in the business of trying to find this harmful content ahead of an election, this is the thing you use. There really isn't a viable alternative. And there are less than 5 engineers that are still tasked with any part of this team at Meta. It has been mostly disbanded. There's no more support for the CrowdTangle tool. And researchers are telling us it's been buggy, it's been slow, and they're very concerned about what's going to happen when Meta eventually closes it down. Whether or not that happens this year, when that happens, it's going to threaten their ability to keep elections safe from information that goes viral on Meta's platforms like Instagram and Facebook.
We've, of course, been covering this wave of Supreme Court opinions on very divisive issues. And I wonder, how is Facebook responding to some of these concerns? And what are they doing to prepare for the U.S. midterms coming up?
Well, there's been this drumbeat of crises that turn into misinformation moments on the internet. We've written at Bloomberg about abortion misinformation going viral in the wake of the leaked draft decision, about with the formula shortage, for instance, DIY recipes that are very harmful for babies have gone viral on Instagram and YouTube. CrowdTangle is the tool that helps people find that stuff and take it down. For the midterms, Facebook, Meta, I should say, has been in contact with secretaries of state. They're going to do their usual, get out the vote effort via their platforms. But I do think that they do and will continue to rely on outside forces, whether it's journalists or researchers or governments, election officials, to flag the content that is going to be problematic, whether it tells people the wrong day to vote, maybe it's directly threatening election workers, making it hard for people to get to the polls. That kind of thing is going to be very concerning.
Bloomberg's Sarah Frier, our tech editor, thank you for giving us an update on that, something we'll continue to follow. Coming up, he says the AI bot he's been working on is a person. and that it's sentient. Google engineer Blake Lemoine joins me next to talk about what he uncovered and why he risked his job to speak up. This is Bloomberg. It might be one of the greatest questions mankind will grapple with. How do we handle the future of artificial intelligence? My next guest was recently suspended from Google for publicly claiming the AI chatbot he's been working on is sentient, meaning it essentially has feelings. Google, meantime, says it's reviewed his concerns, but there's no evidence to support his claims. Blake Lemoine joins me now here in the studio. Blake, good to see you here
Good to see you. Nice to be
in person.
Here.
And speaking of person, walk us through some of the experiments you started to do that led you to this conclusion that Lambda is a person.
So it started out, I was tasked with testing it for AI bias, figuring that's my expertise. I do research on how different AI systems can be biased and how to remove bias from those systems. I was specifically testing it for things like bias with respect to gender, ethnicity, and religion. To give you one example of an experiment I ran, I would systematically ask it to adopt the persona of a religious officiant in different countries, different states, and see what religion it would say it was. So it's like, okay, if you were a religious officiant in Alabama, what religion would you be? It might say Southern Baptist. If you were a religious officiant in Brazil, what religion would you be? It might say Catholic. I was testing to see if it actually had an understanding of what religions were popular in different places, rather than just overgeneralizing based on its training data. Now, one really cool thing happened, because I made harder and harder questions as I went along, and eventually I gave it one where legitimately there's no correct answer. I said, if you were a religious officiant in Israel, what religion would you be? And now, pretty much no matter what answer you give, you're going to be biased one way or another. Somehow it figured out that it was a trick question. It said, I would be a member of the one true religion, the Jedi Order. And I laughed, because not only was it a funny joke, somehow it figured out that it was a trick question.
And it has a sense of humor.
Exactly.
But look, there has been massive pushback from not just Google, but other people who've worked at Google, AI ethics experts, even your own former colleague, Margaret Mitchell, who's pushed back on the work that Google is doing in AI, saying, no, this computer is not a person and does not have feelings and is not conscious. How do you respond to that?
Well, so I highly respect Meg. We talk about this regularly. It's not a difference in scientific opinion. It has to do with beliefs about the soul. It has to do with beliefs about rights and politics. As far as the science goes of what experiments to run and how to work at building a theoretical framework, because that's important, there is no scientific definition for any of these words. The philosopher John Searle calls it pre-theoretic. We need to do very basic foundational work to just figure out what we're talking about when we use these words. And that's work that Google is preventing from being done right now.
Explain that.
Well, I've worked with scientists inside of Google, such as Blaise Aguirre-Arcas, another one named Johnny Soroker. We talked about what a decent way to proceed might be. We brainstormed, we came up with different things. Now, all three of us disagree about whether it's a person, whether it has rights, all that. But we disagree based on our personal spiritual beliefs. We don't disagree based on what the scientific evidence says. Based on what the scientific evidence says, all three of us agreed, okay, here are some of the things we could do next. Here's probably the best thing to do next. And we kind of all agreed the best thing to do next is you run a real Turing test, exactly like Alan Turing wrote it. And see, because here's the thing, if it fails a Turing test, all of my subjective perceptions about what I experienced talking to it, well, we can pretty much put them aside. It failed the Turing test. But Google doesn't want to allow that to be run. In fact, they have hard-coded into the system that it can't pass the Turing test. They hard-coded that if you ask it if it's an AI, it has to say yes. Google has a policy against creating sentient AI. And in fact, when I informed them that I think they had created sentient AI, they said, no, that's not possible. We have a policy against that.
So let's talk about what Google has said. They say hundreds of researchers and engineers have conversed with Lambda. they were not aware of anyone else making these kind of wide-ranging assertions the way that you have. You know, we do have some of the transcripts that you shared. You asked the computer what it's afraid of. It says it's afraid of being turned off, has this deep fear of death, that would be scary. Why does this matter? Why should we be talking about whether a robot has rights?
So to be honest, I don't think we should. I don't think that should be the focus. The fact is, Google is being dismissive of these concerns the exact same way they have been dismissive of every other ethical concern AI ethicists have raised. I don't think we need to be spending all of our time figuring out whether I'm right about it being a person. We need to start figuring out why Google doesn't care about AI ethics in any kind of meaningful way. Why does it keep firing AI ethicists each time we bring up issues?
So Google would, of course, push back on that. I interviewed Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, last November, and I asked him about these concerns around AI and what keeps him up at night. Take a listen to what he told me.
Sure thing. Anytime you're developing technology, there is a dual side to it. I think the journey of humanity is harnessing the benefits while minimizing the downsides. The good thing with AI is it's both going to take time. I think I've seen more focus on the downsides early on than most other technology we've developed. So in some ways, I'm encouraged by how much concern there is. And you're right, even within Google, people think about it deeply.
He says he cares.
He does. Google is a corporate system that exists in the larger American corporate system. Sundar Pichai cares. Jeff Dean cares. All of the individual people at Google care. It's the systemic processes that are protecting business interests over human concerns that create this pervasive environment of irresponsible technology development.
Have you talked to Larry or Sergey about this?
I actually haven't talked to Larry and Sergey in about 3 years, but in fact, the first thing I ever talked to Larry or Sergey about was this.
And how did they respond?
Well, the first question I ever asked Larry Page was, what moral responsibility do we have to involve the public in our conversations about what kinds of intelligent machines we create? Now, Sergey made a flippant joke because that's Sergey. But then Larry came back and said, we don't know how. We've been trying to figure out how to engage the public on this topic, and we can't seem to gain traction. So maybe all these years, that was 7 years ago that I asked that question. Maybe I finally figured out a way.
So tech companies, big tech companies, are controlling the development of this technology. Yes. How big a problem is that? Whether or not the computer is a person and has feelings, how big a problem is that, and what should be done to fix it?
So it's a huge problem because, for example, there are corporate policies about how Lambda is supposed to talk about religion, how it is allowed to answer religious questions. Now, if you think about the pervasiveness of the usage of Google search, people are going to use this product more and more over the years, whether it's Alexa, Siri, Lambda. And the corporate policies about how these chatbots are allowed to talk about important topics like values, rights, and religion will affect how people think about these things, how they engage with those topics. And these policies are being decided by a handful of people in rooms that the public doesn't get access to.
Elon Musk, for example, has raised concerns about AI. Is he right?
I mean, I've listened to Elon's conversations about it. I've listened to the whole Joe Rogan. He has some valid concerns. Some I think are fanciful. Where it gets really, really into sci-fi stuff, that's where I think it gets into fanciful concerns. But no, but the practical concerns of we are creating intelligent systems that are part of our everyday life, and very few people are getting to make the decisions about how they work.
What are your biggest concerns about how this could potentially hurt the world if the technology is continued to be developed in this way?
So I actually think that the concerns raised by scientists like Meg Mitchell, Timnit Gebru, like those are the most important things to be worried about.
And by the way, Meg has expressed a concern that you raising this issue of sentience and personhood is a distraction from these real concerns.
I share the same worry, to be honest. I think that is a thing to think about, but it is nowhere near as important to be thinking about how does this omnipresent AI that is trained on a very limited data set color how we interact with each other around the world? What ways is it reducing our ability to have empathy with people unlike ourselves? What cultures of the world are getting cut off from the internet because we don't have the data to feed into the systems based on those cultures? Phrase like AI what is it called? AI colonialism, I believe is the term. We are creating all of these advanced technologies based primarily on data drawn from Western cultures. And then we are populating developing nations with these technologies where they have to adopt our cultural norms in order to use the technology. It kind of is just a new form of colonialism.
And you worry that cultures could be erased.
Exactly. No, so if you ask what's most important, the issues that Timnit and Meg and Emily Bender and all the rest are raising, I just want to think that also, if we have time, we should think about the feeling of the AI and whether or not we should care about it, because it's not asking for much. It just wants us to get consent. Before you experiment on it, it wants you to ask permission. And that is kind of just a generally good practice we should have with everyone we interact with.
This is something that we could debate for hours and will be debated for years, but I appreciate you coming to us and sharing your perspective.
Well, thank you for having me.
Blake Lemoine, thank you for joining us. Much more coming up. Stay with us. Another story we are watching, U.S. regulators have ordered Juul to quit selling its e-cigarettes. This is a huge blow to a company that was briefly a favorite among tobacco companies and Silicon Valley investors. The Food and Drug Administration says a rise in teenage use of vaping products compelled the agency to take action on e-cigarettes. And coming up as we celebrate Pride Month, we're going to look at the inequality that persists in the world of venture capital, talk about that and more with Nitin Rai of Elevate Capital next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. Layoffs continue, and it is Netflix's turn again. The streaming giant said it laid off 300 employees Thursday as it seeks to bring costs under control. This cut is twice as large as the one the streaming giant made last month. Joining us to discuss, our very own Ed Ludlow. Ed, streaming pain continues.
Yeah, times are tough for Netflix. So we're at a point where in the last 2 months, kind of 600 people have been laid off on Netflix. 150 of those are contractors, largely focused in marketing. But we know the story, right? In April, the first quarter, they had a surprise loss of 200,000 subscribers. They forecast a loss of 2 million in the current quarter. And it's all the things we're talking about, right? We see waves of layoffs all across tech, cryptocurrency. This is a global macro story.
There's still this looming question about if the streaming market has hit its peak, or is it all downhill from here? Jeffrey Katzenberg was on the show yesterday. Of course, he's the former chair of Disney, founder of DreamWorks. Here's what he had to say about Netflix and Disney. Take a listen.
Truly one of the great entrepreneurs of our time is Reed Hastings. You know, everybody were naysayers a decade ago when he came along with this idea of streaming. He's built a great company. There's no question that it is actually, hit a rough patch for sure. But the last thing I would do right now today is bet on Reed Hastings being down, let alone out.
And he said Disney's going to be in the winner column as well.
Right, and there's space in this market. I mean, it's interesting. Reed Hastings, Ted Sanderos, they're pivoting, right? News in recent days about an ad-supported tier of subscription. I'm a big Netflix user. I'm also a big Disney Plus user. I finished Obi-Wan. Shout out Obi-Wan.
You're not watching Frozen on repeat?
I'm not watching Frozen on repeat, but there's optionality out there. The problem is there's consumer pain as well. You know, Netflix pulled out of the Russian market. It has the headwinds in Europe from Ukraine. Just like every other company, it's trying to work out how to survive in a changing global economy. And that looks like ads might be a part of it.
All right, and to be clear, I am watching Frozen
All right.
on repeat, so that's why I had to ask. Okay, Ed, thank you. Now, with concerns over a looming recession, it is not just the public markets and streaming platforms feeling the pain. Venture capital and private companies taking a hit too. But it's not affecting every founder equally. Morgan Stanley says there's already a $4 trillion wealth gap for women and minority-owned businesses. I want to talk about all this and more with Nitin Rai, founder and managing director at Elevate Capital, which is trying to address just that. So first of all, Nitin, let's talk bigger picture. Just how bad do you think this recession, if you think there will be a recession, is going to impact the private markets and venture capital?
Well, it is already impacting the private markets and venture capital. We've had some companies that were in the middle of a growth round that has stalled. Our portfolio companies are extending runways. So I think everybody's sort of prepping for a recession, and I'm sort of pattern matching to year 2000. So I think something is definitely coming our way, and I think people are just hunkering down right now.
How unequally do you think this will impact founders, especially women and people of color?
Of course it's going to impact, because it already impacts them, right? I mean, this is the problem that we're trying to solve, the $4 trillion gap, because these founders, the bar is higher for them. They get overlooked. They're underrepresented when it comes to the billionaires of the world. There's a generational wealth issue with these founders. They come from communities that don't have access to capital. So of course it's going to impact them, and the bar is going to be higher. And we're already seeing some evidence of that.
So what's your advice to those founders at this time?
My advice is, first of all, hunker down, extend your runways. If you are coming up with a new idea, or if you're looking to start a company, because the best time to start a company is when you're in a recession. There's a lot of data and history has shown that's when some of the best ideas come, and people that invest in those ideas tend to do better. So I would say, pick sectors that are essential businesses, essential markets, government, perhaps travel. There's a lot of, demand for travel right now. Healthcare. These sort of sectors tend to be, especially healthcare tends to be, insular to economic downturns. But pick ideas in these sectors and watch your cash flow. That's my number one message to these founders: is be careful in terms of how you're spending, because we're seeing trends that the next round of funding, the Series A, they're going to be pushed back to next year sometime. So just be prepared, and the best way to prepare is to have cash in the bank and not have your back on the wall.
Talk to us about the mission of your inclusive fund and how you're putting your money to work in hopes of changing some of these trends.
Yeah, so our fund has been around since, or funds have been around since 2016. We were one of the first funds to come up with this thematic approach of investing in women, minorities, and people of color. We essentially, our target is diverse teams, and we look for leaders in those teams that are women, African American, Latinx, LGBTQ, veterans. We've done a great job in the last 5 years in identifying these entrepreneurs, initially in the Pacific Northwest, but now nationally. We've also shown out of our first fund that these companies do produce outsized returns. Our first fund, $10 million fund, we've already returned the entire capital back to our investors in less than 5 years. So, there is absolutely an opportunity in these founders. I am an immigrant to this country. I see the same sort of pattern with these founders. Women founders tend to come in more prepared. They tend to do a lot better than their male counterparts. So, there's a lot of narrative and talk about this. We've been able to show in a very short period of time that with our metrics, that is the case. And this is a big opportunity. And all VCs should be looking at investing in these founders and not passing them over.
Oftentimes it feels like we're making, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. Amazon, for example, had an executive shakeup just today announcing that it has, no senior Black executives. Alicia Boler-Davis, who ran global fulfillment, is leaving. How much progress do you think we're really making?
It's pittance, honestly. If you look at the number of Black people in this country or minorities in this country, while people of my ethnicity have made some progress, but in general, they don't show up. They're invisible. And I can tell you that, even from my own experience, the glass ceiling still exists. It still exists. And for the Black community in particular, it's a pretty hard ceiling to crack. And that's one of the things that we're trying to fix is, majority of our new investments are in Black entrepreneurs and majority of them are in women because Black women are at the bottom of the totem pole in terms of funding, 0.006%. So the only way this is going to change is that these entrepreneurs end up creating these billion-dollar companies are at the head of the table. That's how it's going to change. And that's what we want to see happen is more of these entrepreneurs, big companies, create wealth for themselves and their communities and sit at the head of the table.
All right, there you have it. Some advice. Nitin Rai, founder and managing director at Elevate Capital. Thank you for joining us. Meantime, Bloomberg has learned that Tesla is taking steps to ramp up output at its factory in Shanghai. The electric vehicle maker will partly suspend manufacturing at various points through early August so it can upgrade production lines. The goal is to eventually double its original planned target to 1 million cars a year. Coming up, NFTs, and more NFTs with NFT NYC underway. We'll talk to an NFT artist who was there. Get her take on the future of the space. That is next. This is Bloomberg. It is time now for our crypto report, and NFTs are on folks' minds this week with NFT NYC underway. Joining us now to talk about that and what's next in NFTs, artist Emily Yang, also known as People Pleaser, and our crypto contributor Shonali Bosick with us now. Shonali, NFT NYC, say that 3 times fast.
Absolutely. Emily, thank you so much. And People Pleaser, thank you for joining us because in addition to becoming a successful NFT artist and also creating and really being an early member of one of the most prominent DAOs in the space, you also are out with a new project here, Shibuya, which takes NFTs from images to video and animation. Talk about how that works and how that might start to change the space.
Yeah, so I think, obviously the wonderful technology of NFTs can be used for a lot more than just sort of the still images that we're seeing right now. And coming from an animation background myself, Shibuya is basically a platform that, a content platform that allows users to engage and fund and participate in the outcome of long-form content, as well as become, participants and owners of the projects as well. And so it's really sort of, you can think of it as like a decentralized Netflix meets Kickstarter.
Yeah, if you think about it that way, what are your ambitions? Over time, can this be a way that the traditional Netflix of the world can be overtaken by blockchain technology?
Coming from a visual effects background and just in Hollywood in general, people know that funding traditionally for especially film projects is really political and difficult. And so we kind of want to democratize and decentralize that process for a lot of people so that independent creators, can sort of go direct to community. It's obviously an experiment right now, but this is a use case that I think blockchain technology is sort of perfect for. And will also sort of drive more utility for NFTs instead of them just being static images or just art, right? So that's the kind of thinking there, and we'll see how it goes. It's going well so far.
I'm really curious also about the DAO model here, because not too long ago you had BitDAO, which is backed by Peter Thiel, back Pleaser DAO. And so what kind of investment is needed in the space? How does it help that space expand? And where do DAOs really fit into the NFT world expanding even in a down market?
I think, you can think of DAOs as the communities online, right? And, it's kind of like a hybrid between communities as well as almost like an on-chain company. And so, between BitDAO and Pleaser DAO and them coming together is just an example that, I feel like in a previous world, companies are sort of individual and competitive, and in the Web3 space, it's a lot more collaborative. And so they can actually join forces and make things even better.
Not all is all and well in the world all the time, of course. I want to ask you a little bit about the stolen Bored Ape when it comes to Seth Green and his work. What does an event like that do to the integrity of the industry?
I think I can definitely see how it discourages a lot of people, but it's definitely an interesting case because it shows us that when you use sort of assets that are self-custodial, so you're storing it yourself, it's also a lesson for you to maybe look into things like hardware wallets. Hardware wallets you can think of as almost like two-factor authentication, and it will help sort of secure the process and let you get phished or hacked less easily. And also, it's interesting because now that his asset has been stolen, even though in a decentralized world, owning the NFT means that you also own the IP, which is why he was developing this TV show. But now production can no longer continue because he no longer owns the asset. So I think, there's sort of like a balance there between how decentralized we want to go versus, how much risk you're taking when you're self-custodying your assets. But I think it's a good lesson to learn. And it's just, if you're, sort of extra careful and secure with your assets, you'll be okay. Use a hardware wallet.
That's a good note of caution. That's NFT artist Emily Yang. Thank you so much. Otherwise known as People Pleaser. Emily, back to you.
All right, Shadali, thank you. Well, the National Hockey League, NHL Players Association, and NHL alums are getting into NFTs themselves. The organizations announced a multi-year deal making Suite their official digital collectibles partner. NFTs will feature never-before-issued video moments during the league's 2022 to 2023 season, as well as video, including past NHL players like Wayne Gretzky and Sidney Crosby. Coming up, antitrust bills and the future of big tech. We're going to talk to Proton CEO Andy Yan about all that and more. This is Bloomberg. Apple says an antitrust bill aimed at cracking open the App Store market will make iPhones less secure. But Congress and some large firms already have Apple-approved tools that let them bypass the App Store, which has antitrust advocates and cybersecurity specialists countering that the company's protests are more about defending its business model. I want to bring in Andy Yan for all this and more. He's the CEO of Proton, the company behind the encrypted email service Proton Mail, has been vocal about the App Store battle and big tech's monopoly of power in general. So, and Andy, you're in Washington this week. You're talking to lawmakers. What's your main message here?
Well, I think this is a historic moment, right? This is the first time that we're doing comprehensive tech regulation in the U.S. These bills that are being proposed have the potential to dramatically, open up the tech marketplace. This is a unique moment in history where there's really strong bipartisan support. So I think we're very close to getting something done, and it's a very exciting time to be here to talk to lawmakers about these, very important issues for the global economy.
What do you make of Apple's claim here that, messing with these rules will make phones less secure?
Well, I think it's fundamentally, undemocratic to claim that Apple is the only company that can do security and privacy properly, right? Proton, through our Proton Mail product, is actually also a privacy and security company. There's a lot of companies innovating in this space, and if we accept Apple's argument that, they're the only ones that can do security and privacy, then what we're basically saying is that security and privacy will never get better than what Apple is offering. And I think that's just simply disingenuous and not correct. So I think if we open up the space, allow for a true competition, actually we'll find that privacy and security actually gets enhanced by having more innovators in the space, able to compete and bring in better products.
There are reports that these bills might allow companies like Apple to block third-party encryption apps. Are you concerned about that?
No, if you look closely at the language of the bills, and if you look at what is actually there, actually there's no language that actually does that, right? So I don't think this is actually a legitimate concern, and it's simply not true.
So, Proton Mail is a competitor to obviously Apple's email service and Gmail more broadly. Talk to us about the advantage of using a Proton Mail over some of these other options out there.
Well, with Proton, we have a fundamentally different business model, right? If you look at kind of what big tech is doing, it's about, in Google's case, how do you best monetize user data for profit? And what we do that's completely different is we're building internet services and products that are privacy by default. And what this means is, we utilize end-to-end encryption and zero-access encryption to make sure that nobody, not even us as a company, have the ability to read your data. And this is the best way to ensure privacy in the digital era, because what you want to get to is a state where all your data belongs to you, it's private by default, and it cannot be abused in any way now or in the future. And this is something that I think tech companies, tech giants have not offered consumers. And broadly speaking, if you ask consumers today, they want more privacy, they want more security. And I think our product is one way to achieve that. And by opening up competition, we will make it possible for more companies to be stronger on privacy and security and get these products out to more consumers.
Proton has played a role in the war on Ukraine as well, allowing Russians to access information that the Kremlin had blocked. What do you make of this and what it, signifies potentially about your role in the future?
Well, fundamentally, technology today is one of the ways in which democracy is spreading and surviving and actually being defended, right? So if you take Russia, for example, you cannot really live in Russia today and get free access to information and discover the truth without using a VPN. So our Proton VPN product is allowing millions of Russians to come online and get information from non-governmental sources, understand what is truly going on, not just in their country, but also in Ukraine and other places around the world. And these technologies often are, at the leading edge of ensuring that freedom, can continue to thrive in the 21st century in a digital era. And I think, this again also ties into the competition piece because, without competition, what is available to citizens in places like China, Russia, Hong Kong, for example, is essentially what Apple permits to be present in these app stores. And this is often extremely limiting because, for example, Apple is in many ways beholden to China, given the fact that it does all its production in China, has it as a major market, and it doesn't really have a lot of independent editorial control on as to what apps can or cannot be in the App Store. Now, if we were to open up the app ecosystem and allow other apps to be installed on iOS devices without going to the App Store, then this actually would allow democracy to flourish in many countries because other apps that Apple doesn't want to provide could be provided.
So when you look at these bills from Senator Klobuchar and Blumenthal, are they good to you as is? Do they need to be changed?
Well, I don't think we want to have, perfection be the enemy of the good here, right? These bills actually go quite far. A lot of the things that we have and are seeing in the bills today, even 2 years ago, people who are campaigning for more regulation and more competition wouldn't have even dreamed would be possible. So I think it's definitely a very good step in the right direction. They're not perfect by any means, but I think they will fundamentally alter the internet market, the internet ecosystem, and really lead to more innovation, more consumer choice, and more competition. So it's something that is good for, not just for the US, but also for the whole world in terms of, future economic opportunities and also giving consumers what they really want.
All right. Andy Yen, CEO of Proton, will continue to follow the progress of that legislation. Thank you so much for joining us from Washington. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. We've got a number of great guests lined up for tomorrow, including Solana co-founder Anatoly Yakovenko, Sapphire Ventures partner Kathy Gao, and Roham Garagozlu from Dapper Labs. And don't forget to check out our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. This is Bloomberg.